The problem with political decisions isn't that most of us don't get our own way. It's also that these decisions are usually imposed on us against our will by threats of violence. Democracy, as we practice it, is unjust. We expose innocent people to high degrees of risk because we put their fate in the hands of ignorant, misinformed, irrational, biased, and sometimes immoral decision makers. Excellent quote from Against Democracy by Jason Brennan, our guest today. He is the Flanagan Family Chair of Strategy, Economics, Ethics, and Public Policy at McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. Professor, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
What is political philosophy and why should people care?
The pejorative answer is political philosophy is about rationalizing our pre-educated intuitions about justice with sophisticated arguments and without any empirical knowledge. That's my joking stance on it. Political philosophy is a subfield of philosophy that tries to take seriously inquiry about our intuitions about justice, responsibility, the structure of society, what makes societies good or bad, what are the standards by which we should judge different kinds of social institutions and different kinds of social structures. So philosophy is looking at the normative questions about those sorts of things. And I think well done, it's usually informed by the social sciences as well.
I want to talk about your most recent work, a book called When All Else Fails, The Ethics of Resistance to State Injustice. What is the moral parity thesis?
Good. So the moral parity thesis is the claim that the conditions under which you are able to resist injustice conducted by a government official, even one acting in the capacity of their office, are exactly the same as the conditions under which you're allowed to resist me. So basically, there's one set of rules of self-defense and one set of rules for when you're allowed to use violence or subterfuge or deceit or other things to defend other people from injustice. And that same set of rules applies to government agents as it does to defense against civilians. They are one and the same. So government agents are not owed any greater the reverse to that thesis, the thing I'm arguing against, is what you might call the special immunity thesis, which says that government agents, either when they're working within their office or not, or maybe just democratic government agents, but some government agents enjoy a kind of special immunity against resistance and actions to resist their injustice. So if I were to try to kill you right now just for the hell of it because I'm having a bad day and I'm misbehaving, everyone thinks that you'd be allowed to defend yourself against me and that other people will be allowed to intervene to defend you against me. But most people think that if a police officer has a bad day and starts beating the crap out of somebody, that you just have to stop and let them do it. You can complain later, you can file, maybe there should be a formal investigation, but you're not permitted to intervene violently. You're not permitted to lie to the government. You're not permitted to resist them, except under really extreme circumstances. And so the simple claim is just whatever you can do in self-defense or defense of others against anything that I, Jay Brennan, do, you can do against the U.S. president.
So a response to this would be what Thomas Sowell called the constrained vision. In other words, you are one human being in a world of billions where we've had thousands of years of tradition, ideas, process of success, failure, and that has given us the world we have today. You also have a very small amount of information, much like Leonard Read's I Pencil essay. Even if you think you got a grip, you don't have any idea on all the steps it took to get us where we are today. How does the moral parity thesis respond to the constrained vision?
Yeah, the book has a whole bunch of stuff on that kind of issue. The idea of a sort of Burkean type conservative approach, or the idea of like epistemic deference. And so I think that's all correct, but all of that's compatible. Well, what it implies we might disagree about, but I think there's something to that, but it's all compatible with an idea of moral parity. So think of it like this. Like imagine I'm working in the military and my commanding officer says, Jay, I need you to throw a grenade over there. All right. And then simultaneously, as he says that, I get a phone call from my friend Corey from high school. And he says, Jay, I need you to throw a grenade, 150 yards. I don't know if I can throw that far, 25 yards to the right. And it just happens to be exactly the same place that my commanding officer was ordering me to throw the grenade. And in both cases, I don't have any information about who's over there, or why they should be killed, or why a grenade should be thrown. I just have two people issuing orders. Well, it makes sense to say that I have stronger grounds to defer to the judgment of my commanding officer because empirically speaking, it's more likely he knows something that I don't, and that he has good and legitimate grounds for me to throw it. And if I knew that information, I should. And that we might be in an emergency circumstance where he doesn't have time to explain. So that kind of point that under certain circumstances, you have reason to think one person is more likely to be right, and as a result, you should consider deferring to them, holds, and it sometimes holds of government agents. But we also have to be really careful about that, because I want to be an empiricist about this point and say, we have lots of empirical evidence that say American police officers use excessive amounts of police violence, that they very readily use it. We have sociological work that explains why they do that and shows that it's not serving any kind of deeper purpose, that it's not the result of like experimentation, but the result of like perverse incentives and problems. Like, so there's a really good book called The Rise of the Warrior Cop by Randy Balco, and it can explain how perverse economic incentives led to the overuse of SWAT teams. So we understand where that comes from. So when you have that kind of evidence, you have to say, well, we have good reason to think that this is not a time to defer to these people. I mean, granted, it's still the case that if you walk, even in like the United States where police officers tend to be excessively violent, if you see 3 police officers beating up somebody, it's more likely they have reason to do that than if you see 3 random people who look like me wearing Georgetown t-shirts beating somebody up, that the police officers are justified rather than we are. But nevertheless, if they're the kinds of cases I have in mind that I talk about in the book, and I have all these thought experiments, but all of the thought experiments are based on actual cases. And I was sort of required by the Princeton University Press's lawyers to not quite refer to them directly and say this is just what happened there, but just say it's similar to this case, because I want to avoid any possible lawsuits from anyone. But anyways, they're all based on real cases, and if you see something like a police officer has a person lying prostrate on the ground, his hands are bound, and then he pulls out a gun and shoots him. Well, you as a person witnessing this, I'm arguing, are justified in shooting the police officer to stop him. I'm not recommending you do that because chances are they'll send a SWAT team to kill you. But a lot of the question of this book is not what's the most instrumentally useful way to prevent injustice, but rather what are you permitted to do? And so an analogy here would be like, imagine you and I are in school and I'm a bully and I'm constantly picking on you to take your lunch money. Now, you could imagine a circumstance in which if you stand up to me, because I'm so big and so mean, you'll fail and I'll just beat you up and take your lunch money anyways. In that kind of situation, we could say, you are still morally justified in standing up to me. You do not owe it to me to avoid resisting me. You don't owe it to me to defer my bad behavior, but nevertheless, it might be imprudent to do so. It's not a rational choice to make, even though it's a reasonable choice.
So Bernie Sanders was actually asked about, what do you think about all this excessive force that we see because of people with cell phones and whatnot? And he says that we need to his general response was, we need to act peacefully through the judicial system, and we also need to make sure we have training for the officers. So so maybe we shouldn't talk about resisting. We should talk about these other mechanisms for change. How does Professor Brennan respond to that?
I mean, I wish if I were faster on my feet, I'd change my guitar amplifier background to that meme that has like little girl going, "Why not both?" And everyone picks her up. Because I think it's important we disambiguate 2 questions here. One is, what's the best mechanism for stopping a systematic problem? And the other is, what's the mechanism for stopping this particular problem right now? So imagine you take the case of like, there's evidence that say college fraternities have an unusually bad drinking culture that leads to an excess of date rape. And then imagine a guy's about to like date rape a girl, and she thinks about violently resisting him because he's using violence against him. And then imagine Bernie Sanders shows up. I'm not saying he would say this, but imagine he sends up and says, hold on, there's this whole problem of rape culture and date rape culture and a systematic explanation for why these sorts of behaviors take place. If we want to fix fraternity culture, you punching this guy and running away isn't going to fix that. All it's going to do is like maybe make him more violent in the future for perhaps. And what we really need to do is like shut down fraternities or reform them or have better education and have a better kind of civic culture that eliminates rape culture. He could say all that stuff, and if he's talking about what does it take to fix the systematic problem, it will require probably systematic changes. But that doesn't mean that you have to suffer the injustice at that moment, or that you have to permit someone else to suffer that injustice. Like if you want to fix police officers, like as a whole, then shooting this particular police officer is unlikely to do that. But you're not obligated to suffer the consequences or permit someone from committing an injustice just because it won't fix the systematic problem. She would be justified in resisting rape. You would be justified in resisting arrest or resisting the excessive violence or whatever else it might be.
I want to talk about my favorite book of yours called Political Philosophy: An Introduction. Here is Barack Obama in his Senate debate from 2006. I think the proper role of government is to do things that we can't do as well individually as we can do collectively. Professor Brennan, how would you define government as opposed to something like that?
I tend to defer to Max Weber and Gregory Kafka on what government is. So Kafka tends to, he's this famous neo-Hobbesian philosopher, unfortunately passed away kind of young. He says government is the subset of a society, and what counts as society? No one ever answers that question satisfactorily. There's not a good answer to the question, what is society in political philosophy, by the way. You think there would be, but we haven't figured that out. A government is the subset of a society which claims to have a legitimate monopoly on the use of force, a legitimate monopoly on the right to make fundamental rules, and also has sufficient physical power to actually back up that monopoly. Right? So that's why like a failed state like we might have had in Somalia in the late 80s would be something where there might be a group that claims to have a monopoly, but they're not actually able to maintain it. So the government sort of failed in that sense. So government is a group of people, a subset that has a monopoly of force and makes rules and actually imposes those rules upon others. That's not a perfect definition because, of course, lots of rules come about through non-governmental means. There's all sorts of private governance, even under states where there are governments, but the states claim to have this fundamental law-making power, and they have the ability to back it up. Government's not the name we give to the things that we do together. We do all sorts of things together without government. Government is the name that we give to the people with the guns. Whether that's good or bad is an open question, but that's fundamentally what a government is.
Sure, yeah, that's what makes it a unique institution. You talk about two things in this book, authority and legitimacy. What is authority and legitimacy?
Good. It's worth noting for people who, I say this in that book, I say it in the When All Else Fails book, the terms authority and legitimacy are used quite frequently by political philosophers, but they're not perfectly standardized. So I use them a particular way, but what everyone agrees upon is that governments claim to have two special moral powers or moral properties. So one is governments claim that they have the ability and the permission to create rules and enforce those rules with violence. I use the word legitimacy to refer to that. Legitimacy means the permissibility of using violence to do something. And when we're talking about government legitimacy, the permissibility of using violence and other kinds of aggressive coercive means to force compliance with rules that you make. So that's legitimacy. Authority is supposed to refer to the idea of when they issue a command or an edict, a law or regulation, you have an obligation in virtue of them issuing that command to follow it. So it's very important that when you ask, is there a duty to obey the law? You're asking, is there authority? Does that government have authority over you? And it's important to note that you could have an obligation to obey the law, but not because it is the law. And that, in which case it's not authority. So if I say right now, I, Jay Brennan, hereby declare myself to be the one and true emperor of the planet Earth, and I now command all of you watching, never to commit murder. Well, you have an obligation to do the thing that I said, avoid committing murder, but you don't have that obligation because I said so. You don't owe it to me or owe it to other people to listen to me per se. My command is sort of morally inert. So in contrast, people who believe in the idea of an obligation to obey the law per se think that when certain government agents or actors or bodies issue commands or laws, you have to obey that law because they said so. They cause you to have an obligation. They might add an additional source of, like if the government commands you not to murder, they think you had a pre-existing obligation not to murder, plus now you have an obligation not to murder because the government said so. You have two different grounds for it. Or it might be in some cases you didn't have any obligation at all until you were so commanded. The military officer had no obligation to attack another country until he was told to do so by his superior.
What is the or what do you think is the reason that two very smart, well-intended people can so strongly disagree on things like political philosophy?
Oh, I think that's a Actually, a couple things. And the one is, I think people don't disagree on political philosophy nearly as much as we think. So most of what I do, most of my work is on democratic behavior, democratic pathologies, thinking about the psychology of, I should be looking at the camera instead of looking at you, thinking about the psychology of voters. And if I want to recommend two political science books to people, not political philosophy, but political science, to really understand.
Hey, Professor, I'm sorry. Once you leaned in, you started breaking up a little. Let's see how it is now.
Okay. I'm going to recommend two political science books to readers that will really tell you a lot about how voters think. So one is called Neither Liberal Nor Conservative by Kinder and Calmo. And they argue that based upon a wide range of studies that have been done over the past 70 years, that really only at most about 16 out of 100 Americans has a stable ideology or a stable set of political beliefs, let alone a coherent political philosophy where it all fits together, but just having stable beliefs at all. And then another book called Democracy for Realists by Aiken and Bartels is about the psychology of voters and says something pretty similar. So a good way to think about it is that for most citizens, it works something like this. I'm from the New England area. As a result of being from the New England area, I root for the Boston Red Sox and the Patriots, and I think that Tom Brady is the greatest quarterback of all time, which he really is. But I would think that anyways because I'm from New England. And so you might wonder, why do you root for New England and not for like New York? Well, it's because I'm from New England and not from New York, right? So why it's not like I happen to pick, like I'm gonna root for the best team and it happens to be the Patriots, which it kind of has been for 20 years. We'll see what happens now. But I rooted for them back when they sucked, which is their history up before 2001. Because it's like a way of showing my fidelity to my group. It shows I'm a member of the Boston community. It shows that I'm like one of you, and that serves this purpose of creating bonding and community. And oftentimes when you have these communities that have bonding and so on, you have to have an outgroup that reinforces the bonding within the community. So this is like a well-established sociological, psychological phenomenon for human beings. It looks like this is true about most people's political beliefs. So what Aiken and Bartel say is that people have an idea of what their fundamental kind of demographic identity might be, like who they are as a person, and then through basically random historical circumstance, different identities get attached to different parties, and most people just vote that party because that's what people like them do. Oh, you're a Boston Irish person. Boston Irish people vote Democrat. Why do they vote Democrat rather than Republican? Not because the Democrats help them more, not because they share their beliefs, but just historical circumstance. And then some people then learn what their party believes, and they claim to believe that too, and they might even rationalize that they do, but that's fundamentally what's going on. So I think it's a long answer to your question, but I think the amount of actual genuine disagreement in politics is much less than we think, because it really comes down to 15 out of 100 people, 16 out of 100 people have anything at all like a political philosophy. Beyond that, I mean, we're beset by a wide range of cognitive biases. There's problems of actually acquiring information. There's all sorts of different levels of information, and we can't read it all. So those sorts of things might predict our behavior. There's even strong evidence that there's a genetic component to our disposition to believe one thing versus another. So, I mean, people on the left love publishing papers saying that the reason people are conservative is because they're dumb. They claim it's a lack of analytic ability. Though the same papers, for what it's worth, also say that libertarian-minded people are the most analytic. So maybe there's something about that too. Maybe it's just the degree to which you engage in abstract analysis influences your politics. So there's dozens and dozens of reasons, but I think we should be clear that the amount of apparent political disagreement is much higher than the amount of genuine political disagreement.
Oh, absolutely. It's like in 2012, there's all this fighting, and really it's just Romney wanted to keep the 39% tax cut or take it to 36. Obama wanted it to expire. It's like they both supported mass war, mass murder, mass theft, and mass kidnapping.
Heavy restrictions on immigration. I mean, I'm a pro-immigration guy, and people are like, "You must love the Democrats," and I'm like, that's like saying like you got one group wants to restrict 99%, and the other's like 98.3%. And they're like, the 99% group's calling the 98.3% group open borders people. I'm like, no, I'm open borders. You are restrictionists.
I know. Yeah, they should check out my talk with Brian Kaplan. You talk about, here's one really, really big thing. that I think people need to grasp, and I wish I had a better understanding of. What's the difference between a positive right and a negative right?
Okay, basically what they require of you. So a positive obligation or a positive right means that other people have an enforceable obligation to do something for me. A negative right means other people have an enforceable obligation to avoid doing certain things to me. So an example of a negative right would be, I owe it to you not to kill you, right? I have an obligation, it's owed specifically to you, and the obligation forbids me from killing you. So negative rights say don't do stuff, but they give you options otherwise. Like I'm allowed to be on this podcast, I'm allowed to like play Skyrim, I'm allowed to play guitar, I'm allowed to go for a jog, but I'm not allowed to kill you. Positive obligations are like I owe you something in particular. So for example, my children have all these positive rights against me. I owe it to them to feed them, to house them, to provide them with education, to provide them with various kinds of tools, to be loving and kind towards them, and so on. So, and this is an enforceable obligation because people think it's like legitimate for the state or some other group to punish me if I don't do it, or to take the children away from me if I don't, and to castigate me if I don't behave in certain ways.
You talk about the term pro tanto in political philosophy and introduction. What is the difference between believing something and believing something pro tanto?
Yeah, it's one of those fancy words philosophers use. They used to say well, hold on. They'd say prima facie, but they pronounce it prima facie because they didn't take Latin, I guess, properly, or they took like the wrong kind of Latin. I took my Latin class. We used like Wheelock's textbook, and they taught us to say facie, and then I started saying that in philosophy classes, and they're like, we all say fascia. Anyways, I'll probably get angry emails about the proper pronunciation now. But anyways, they switched to saying pro tanto because it's a slightly better word. What we just mean is that sometimes a better word even than that would be presumptive. The thought is that there are certain presumptive obligations or duties you might have towards others, but they can sometimes be overridden or forfeited or canceled. So if I promise you to meet you, like I promised to meet you at 3:00 today to like record this podcast. In virtue of having made that promise to you and you're coming to rely upon it, I pro tanto owe it to you to show up. However, that can be defeated by contrary consideration. So for example, if right before the podcast took place, I noticed that there was a little kid outside like who got hit by a car on the street, I would be permitted to go and rescue that kid rather than meet with you. I might still owe it you in like an apology that you're supposed to say, oh, it's okay, you're being a hero. So it can be defeated by contrary considerations. So the difference between a pro tanto obligation is an obligation that just is never defeatable. There's no contrary consideration that can ever override it. It's an absolute obligation.
One of the main theories that both left and right generally disagree with, at least when they're talking to me, is the social contract theory. The belief that there is a general obligation to obey a state because in exchange you reap benefits from the existence of that state. What is the political philosophical approach to social contract theory?
Yeah, there are still people who call themselves contractarians, but like Jerry Gauss might be one. But it's worth noting that the people who call themselves contractarians in contemporary philosophy would say, no, the social contract is a complete and total metaphor. There's no actual contract, and it's just a device for illustrating like why people might have duties. So I think I can say with a lot of like, it's basically the case in modern contemporary political philosophy that no one believes in anything like a genuine social contract. That's like an archaic idea. So the thought is supposed to be like Thomas Hobbes has like one of the original social contract theorists says, the state of nature is awful and we're all fighting each other constantly because we can't trust. We know some people are trying to dominate one another. We know that most people aren't, but we nevertheless can't figure out who's a dominator and who's not. And this mutual diffidence creates mutual distrust. And so we're all kind of constantly at war, and this is suboptimal. So what we're going to do is come together and agree with one another that we're going to, so we form a social contract with one another, and we agree we're going to obey this guy, the Leviathan. And so for those keeping track at home, you don't actually have a contract with the Leviathan on the Hobbesian theory. You have a contract with other citizens to obey the Leviathan, with whom you have no contract at all. And then Locke has a variation on this, and Rousseau has another variation on it, and in proper Rousseauian way, it's crazy. But anyways, so that's the idea behind a social contract. We make an agreement to do a certain thing. And David Hume made fun of this back in the day, even before the United States was created. He's like, in reality, there's no actual social contract. There's not like a point where a bunch of people living in anarchy get together and say, hey, let's all agree to certain rules. And then somehow those rules were downed upon us. He's like, what actually happens is you have like tribal groups, and the strongest person, for the most part, rules over the weaker people. And in order to stay in power, they may have to give them some benefits. And then over time, there's lots of war. And eventually you get like the big warlord, and they sort of have power, and they rule through conquest, and their continued rule is supported because they do just enough good stuff, a combination of carrots and sticks, to make sure that they stay in power. That's the actual genesis of every single government. And he's like, the idea that like your compliance with government is voluntary is nonsense. It's like, you don't have a choice. So when you think about like a genuine consensual agreement, like take our meeting today, you suggested to me, I forget it was whether email or Facebook or something, but you said, hey, do you want to meet and like do this podcast? And I said, yes. Had I said no, it wouldn't have happened. Had you said no, it wouldn't have happened. So our saying yes was required for it to happen. Our saying no was sufficient to make it not happen. I had reasonable ways of opting out. So it wasn't like you said, hey, join me for this podcast. And if you don't want to, that's fine. Signal your willingness to not be on the podcast by chopping off your right arm. Otherwise, I'm going to make you do it. Like, there's an actual legitimate, easy way of opting out of it that's not caused by you, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to like government interaction, that stuff doesn't obtain for most of us. You don't actually have any point at which you express consent. Like I expressed consent to be married. There was no point at which I expressed consent to be governed by the US government. You don't have any way of opting out. You can't even move to Antarctica. Like the governments will forbid you from leaving. And so for government, no means yes. And you don't have like a reasonable way of opting out because they've taken all the land and they control all of it, and they'll still push you around regardless. So David Hume's metaphor for this was something like, imagine like you've been kidnapped and you wake up on a ship in the middle of the ocean, and the captain says, hey, it's my way or the highway. You either agree to the social contract where I'm the captain, or if you don't like it, there's the exit. And then you choose not to leave. He's like, you haven't really agreed to it because your only option is to jump off the ship and die. And if it turns out that there's like two other more or less identical captains out there with identical ships, and you could jump to another ship or die, it doesn't still look like real consent. So that seems implausible. And then like there's a variety of consent theory called hypothetical consent, which says, well, you would have agreed to it in the absence of, like, if you were given the option, you would have agreed to it. But the problem then is hypothetical consent only works in special cases. Like you show up at the hospital, you're having a heart attack, and you're unconscious. We don't have any evidence that you have certain kinds of religious views that forbid you from getting treatment, and you don't have like any sort of do not resuscitate order or anything like that. We presume on your behalf that you consent to us treating you. However, if you wake up and in your full consciousness and you're not insane, you're not delirious, and you go, no, I don't want to be resuscitated, let me die. Well, then your explicit rational dissent defeats any presumption of consent in hypothetical cases. But when it comes to government, it doesn't. So government, the relationship towards government and with each other is like a contract, the same way that like Sprite is like the number 3. They're just not analogous really at all.
Sure. You mentioned in this book, Against Democracy, that the majority of voters are ignorant about politics, even after 12 years of government education, even after all this media 24-hour news cycle that we always get. Why are people ignorant about politics? Because on the face of it, you'd think you have every incentive to get informed, elect the right people, and make sure you're represented. Why are the vast majority ignorant about politics?
Yeah, and it's for those who people don't know the facts. I mean, the numbers are astounding. Like a good summary would be, the typical American knows who the president is and pretty much nothing else, right? If you think of your head as you're listening to me, like what's something you think someone should know to be a good voter, and probably whatever you just thought of, most people don't know. Maybe someone come up with a counterexample, but like probably what you thought of, they don't know. So why don't they know it? And the dominant explanation in political science and economics is what's called the rational ignorance theory. So the idea behind, if you want to sort of summarize the economics of information in like one sentence, you can think of it like this. People tend to know something and retain that knowledge just in case the value of knowing it is higher than the cost of knowing it, right? So an example that would be like imagine to illustrate a case where you wouldn't know something because the value is not very high. Think about like a phone book. You know, if you have one of those, the phone book contains a huge number of truths in it, but you probably haven't memorized it. Why not? Because you don't expect the value of memorizing to be very high. If you need to know something, you can look it up on your phone, not in a phone book. Right? I don't know the names of your parents, but you do, right? Because it's useful to you. It's not useful to me. Think about imagine a class. Illustrate the dilemma that voters. Imagine the following. Your class at Berkeley. They have I think biology 101. I think it's like 1,000 students on it. I might be wrong. I think that's about right. Because there are all these pre-med majors. And imagine the professor gets up and says, "I, Professor Brennan, am an egalitarian, and because I'm an egalitarian, I want to make sure that everyone gets the same grade in this class. So here's what I'm going to do. 15 weeks from now, you're going to take a final exam. That exam will be worth 100% of your grade in this class. But you won't receive your grade and you won't receive your grade. Rather, I'm going to average everybody's grades together and you all receive exactly the same grade." And then ask, how hard would people study? What would the average grade be? Now, these are Berkeley undergrads. They're smart. They're motivated. They have incentives to get a good grade in the class. But you nevertheless would expect the average grade to be really low, probably like an F. And in fact, we're doing some experiments on this, and that's what you get, like Fs. People don't learn anything. And the reason they don't is because they're like, if I work really hard, I still get the same grade as everybody else. If I don't work, I still get the same grade as everybody else. I can't really count on other people working. There's too many people, so it's not like I can like push them around and browbeat them into doing the work. I might as well just slack off. And everyone thinks the same thing, and the average grade ends up being an F. So what happens in an election is basically we have this final exam that's worth a tremendous amount every 4 years, but instead of having 1,000 other voters or other people taking the test with you, you're taking this test with potentially up to 210 million other people, though in reality it's more like 140 million or so. And so your vote doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter which way you vote, and so you don't have a strong incentive to know the stuff that you would need to know in order to vote well. A good way to illustrate that, I put this in one of my books. When I'm calculating the exact odds, and I won't do that right now, but like if you're a Jewish person in Germany in like the last couple elections in 1932, for the Nazis and nationalist parties to win a coalition government is a disaster for you. It's horrible if that happens. But the utility of you voting for them, the utility of you voting against them, are basically the same because the chances of you making a difference are so vanishingly small. In the same way, a lottery ticket could be worth $100 million if you win, but an individual lottery ticket isn't worth buying because the chances of you winning are so low that it discounts the value of that ticket. Another example I gave was, imagine it's the election in 2008, and at the time, candidate Obama calls me on the phone and says, "Jason, if you vote for me," he's not paying me to vote for him. He says, "Jason, if I win the election, I promise to pay you $10 million out of the U.S. Treasury." Now, I want to be clear. I can absolutely be bought. For $10 million, if a $10 million victory, that sounds great. I'm willing to do that. Does it make sense for me to vote for him for that selfish reason? No, because it turns out I had a higher probability of dying in a car accident on the way to the voting booth than I did of casting a vote that would have made a difference. So if we take that $10 million that I get if he wins and discount that by the probability that my vote will decide the election, that works out to be 1.45 times 10 to the negative $2,645. So 0.2600 zeros, some money, nothing. Voters don't know the exact odds, but they are aware that their votes basically don't count, and they act accordingly.
Is it still important to say, yes, my vote means very little, but look, if I stole one car in the grand scheme of the world, it wouldn't be that big of a deal overall? Isn't democracy something inherently worthwhile, much like a symbolism of a painting, or maybe even a person who is an end in and of themselves?
Well, even the case of stealing one car, that's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. But if you steal one car from a person who's using it, you're probably going to cause a pretty significant loss to their welfare. Even if they have an insurance, that's still coming out of other people's welfare. But if you're talking about like one reason I have this background is my wife keeps a lot of like junk in this room, though she has mostly cleaned it up now. So like in the closet that's behind me, behind this like picture of an ant that you guys are seeing, there's a bunch of weird, just like random stuff that she keeps, like in case she needs it, like crafty things and so on. And I'm sure if you stole like one pipe cleaner out of there, we would never miss it. It would have no effect. And so that might be a better metaphor for like a vote or something. I tend to think like, think about voting as it matters that enough people do it, and what really matters that people do it well. It doesn't matter in particular that you do it. If you have these goals of expressing your commitment to equality, well, there's all sorts of other stuff you could do that would much better express that and have a much better effect on actual promotion of equality. If you care about promoting other people's welfare, rather than voting, you could go to a soup kitchen and volunteer for 5 minutes. 5 minutes volunteering in a soup kitchen will cover you in all your voting for the rest of your entire life. So it's a very ineffective way to express your fidelity to these things. So there is value to symbolism and so on, but I tend to think that we should be instrumentalist about symbolism. I'm wearing a Georgetown t-shirt right now that expresses some degree of fandom for my employer, the university at which I work. If it turned out though that wearing Georgetown t-shirts like systematically killed people, I would probably find some other way of expressing my commitment to Georgetown other than wearing t-shirts. And if I said, no, I understand that wearing Georgetown t-shirts systematically kills people, but it's important to express my fandom for my school, you guys would be like, oh, so you're an asshole. And that would be the correct reaction. So I tend to think like if you're the kind of person who votes badly and your excuse is you want to express commitment to democracy, frankly, I mean, your vote doesn't count for very much, so you're not really causing a lot of harm. But people like you as a group are causing severe and serious harm to other people, and you're doing it for kind of crummy reasons. Can't you find some other way to express your values? A way that doesn't have this systematically harmful effect?
You wrote a book called you responded to a book by Michael Sandel, who is one of my favorite philosophers.
Political theorist. He's a theorist. It's a difference.
Yes. Theorist, that's right. He was the first time I ever heard of political philosophy, where he says, for heaven's sake, stop commodifying everything. By buying and selling some things, we diminish their value. For example, when a groom gives a toast, it's supposed to be from his heart, not because he found someone else to write it for him, or proposal ideas, or giving your own kidney, which is the very source of your life, or writing plays. What is wrong with outlawing things to make sure they're valued properly in society?
I mean, that's a big question. The book is a couple hundred. I have a book responding to, and it's a few hundred pages, because we basically say the people who are against commodifying things, we come up with my co-author Peter Jaworski and I come up with a taxonomy of about 7 fundamental kinds of objections they have to commodification, and each kind has a bunch of different things, and we basically go and attack them piece by piece. Like, here's a response to this type of objection, here's a response to this one. So I can't cover that all in like very quickly, but we can talk about some specific examples and some of the worries about them. Take the thing about the groom and like writing it from your heart. Notice how socially contingent that is. Now, I'm not an ethical relativist fundamentally, but I want to point out that certain norms are genuinely relative, and you could imagine it going the other way. And when you realize that, you could recognize that there's not really much moral force to it. So it happens to be the case that like in the US, like current culture, to give a monetary gift as opposed to like a so-called thoughtful gift is seen as especially thoughtful. It wasn't always the case. It turns out there's a really good work by the sociologist Viviana Zelazar at Princeton showing that like in the late 1800s, it's actually seen as more thoughtful to give a cash gift and less thoughtful to give a gift in kind, contrary to what Sandel thinks. So some of these things are just contingent matters about how people think today. You could imagine a world like ours where the norm is, during a wedding, if you're giving a speech, in order to express your commitment to the groom, in order to prove that you really are a good best man who really cares about him, you need to go and pay a professional speechwriter to write you a really good speech, and then you deliver it. In the same way that, like, you know, why did I have to give my, at the time, girlfriend an expensive piece of junk in order to get her to marry me? Well, it's, look, I love you so much that I spent, like, what was it, $6,500 or something, which I don't have because I'm a grad student, $6,500 on a piece of garbage that I want you to wear on your finger for the rest of your life. Like, it's proof I must really care about you, right? Whereas if I'd like, just taken a ring and whittled it out of wood and it took me 40 hours to make it, she'd be like, what the hell? So you can imagine a world like ours where in order to prove that you really care about the groom, if as a best man, you have to spend like 2 months' salary buying a professional speech. And in that world, if you were to give the speech that you yourself wrote, people would think that you're cheap and uncouth and uncaring. So these norms, a lot of these norms about this expresses this or it expresses that, it's just a contingent social construct about how we happen to think. Even the idea that money has a profane meaning is a contingent thing that some Westerners think today. They didn't used to think it, and around the world, people don't think that way. In some cultures, you're supposed to spend money on things that he says you can't commodify. You're supposed to, for the Marina people of Madagascar, you're supposed to pay your wife after you have sex with her, and failure to do so is disrespectful and has nothing to do with patriarchy. It's not anti-feminist. If you understand their culture, you'd be like, oh, I understand why they do that. It's a respectful thing to do. And so then we say, okay, so if these things are just culturally contingent, then we have to ask, is there reason to pick one construct over others? For example, in some cultures, it's expected you bury the dead. And in some cultures, it's expected you burn the dead. In some cultures, it was expected that you eat the dead. On its face, all of these are equally valid ways of expressing respect. But it turns out eating the dead causes disease and kills you. When you learn that, you should stop eating the dead and pick one of these other things. It also turns out that the way that Michael Sandel wants to hypostatize and reify the current Western conception of money, of monetary value as profane and utilitarian, this contingent Western projection onto money that's not built into the fabric of money or the fabric of the universe, kills people. So when he says, like, oh, we shouldn't sell kidneys because that shows disrespect for life. It's like the social practice of not selling kidneys and justifying on the grounds that it's icky and that it's commodifying life kills people. So perversely, the refusal to commodify life comes at the expense of life, right? There are 100,000 Americans right now, actually a little bit higher number than that, who are on the kidney wait list. The overwhelming majority of them will never get a kidney. They won't get one. There's about 10,000, or it was about 6,000 Canadians on the list. I'm putting out because my co-author's Canadian. They will not get kidneys. Very few of them will. Why won't people give away kidneys? They're not nice enough to do it on their own. They could, but they don't. When Michael Sandel was in college, he didn't give away a kidney because he's not a nice enough person. When I was in college and healthy enough to do it, I didn't give away a kidney because I'm not a nice enough person. I've given talks about this to about 10,000 people. I've asked them, have any of you ever given away a kidney to help a stranger? And no one ever has. They're not nice enough to do it on their own, but if you paid them to do it, they would do it. And so if we had a rule that said, like, we're offering you, like, you can pay people $50,000 to give away a kidney, people would do it. And if in all the worries we say in the book, Markets with Limits, we say, whenever people worry about commodification, it's almost always the case that if they have a legitimate worry, it's only about a contingent feature of the market, which we could eliminate. So some people say, like, they might say, well, the problem is if we can sell kidneys, then really desperately poor people would sell their kidney and richer people wouldn't, and you'd exploit them. Now, part of my response is to say, if you have a person who's in such dire straits that their best option is to sell a kidney, and you take that away from them, you're a horrible human being who doesn't care about social justice. Your moral sense is completely warped. Like, I hope you're not voting. It's a forceful thing to say, but it's true. Like, you're by hypothesis, you're like, this is a horrible thing for that human being to have to do, but also it's their best option, which means the next best thing is something they're going to do. If you take away a kidney, they're selling the kidney, they're going to do something even worse than that. So by hypothesis, you don't want to take that away. So part of me says, let the poor sell kidneys, because if that's what they're willing to do, that's their best option. And who am I to take away people's best option? I mean, I'm not an evil person like Sandel is. But secondly, I'd say, like, even if I'm wrong about that and Sandel is right and they can't consent and we should just not let them do it, fine. Then forbid kidney sales for people who don't make a lot of money, but then allow people who make a certain amount of money to sell their kidneys. Like, if I sold my kidneys for $50,000, no one would think I'm being exploited. I'm not in desperate financial straits. I'm doing just fine. Like, I have a secure job for life. I've got like a fancy endowed chair. I'm in the top like 1% of American income earners. If I want to sell my kidney for $50,000, no one's exploiting me. Let people like me sell it.
Sure. Dennis Prager has put forth a challenge to people like you, people like me. to explain why murder is morally wrong without appealing to a deity. Please lead by example and let us see how you do it.
Without appealing to a deity. No, to be honest, I think it's really hard to explain the fundamental reasons for ethics, and I don't think anyone has a successful answer to that question, including Dennis, by the way. I think appealing to God is like appealing to God is like a really, really crummy answer, and then the other answers the secular answers that philosophers give are also pretty crummy, if not as crummy. Because if you want to, it's intuitively we think it's wrong to hurt people, and we can start talking about what features is it about certain kinds of sentient beings that gives rise to the idea that their interests matter. Is it have something to do with like the capacity to feel pain? Is it something about their rational faculty that commands respect? And you can give answers to those things. They're never fully satisfactory. They never fully have the feel of a knockdown proof. So I think if he says like, if he were to just say the secular meta-ethical foundations of morality are pretty weak, like the meta-ethics of morality are weak, and there isn't a really good knockdown answer in philosophy, I'd be like, as a person who studied that stuff, I agree. That's true. We don't have like proof that it's like that. I mean, I can say things like, if you want to talk about why you have certain moral intuitions and why you should take them as reliable, I'd say Michael Huemer has a really good book called Ethical Intuitionism that's all about justifying the epistemology of our moral intuitions and why we should think that they're reasonable and how we deal with conflict and so on. I think that's a good response to him, but it's not knockdown proof. But that said, I don't know what appealing to God does. I think it just has like almost, and I'm not even saying that you should reject God or anything, or that God has no role for morality, but I think when you see what people do when they appeal to God, they usually have like a very kind of crude divine command theory, or like a crude kind of idea that like, well, morality is weird and God's magic, and so somehow God explains it. But you're like, well, we'll go ahead and explain how he explains it. And they're like, well, I don't know, but we just appeal to God, and then like thought ends. It's like, well, no. So Plato famously has a critique of divine. I mean, I don't know if Prager is a divine command theorist. I don't watch Prager's stuff. If he writes stuff, I don't read it. I guess he has like some sort of like Prager University or something. So Plato, back in 400 years before Christ, says like, all right, why do you have an obligation? Like, why think we have an ethical obligation? And one answer is, well, because God said so. And he's like, okay, so if God commands you not to if God commands you not to kill people, let me ask the question: does the reason that you're not supposed to kill people because God told you to, or did God tell you not to because you had an independent reason not to? Right? Because it seems like if God says, don't kill people, don't rape them, do support them, do provide welfare for them, and so on, probably it wasn't like God was just like, all right, I'm going to make some commands and give people some orders to do something. I'm just going to pick things at random. Okay, rape, flip a coin, came up heads. Okay, rape is wrong. Feeding your children, flip a coin, came up tails. Okay, you're supposed to feed your children. It's not probably that's not what God did. Probably there's some reason for God to pick one thing over the other for the issues. Whatever that reason is that God is following, that makes it so that moral is presumably whatever the ethical foundation wants to appeal to. When you recognize that, you realize that God has no essential connection to like morality here. It's just maybe he can inform you of it. Maybe he's an expert, but it's not clear that like you need, like, he's not creating them. And so then people respond by going, oh, that's just archaic divine command theory. Morality inheres in the nature of God, but that's just this completely mysterious notion. It doesn't really answer any questions for us. Hume said, if you're going to appeal to like moral facts inhering in the fabric of God, like a simpler theory would be they're just moral facts and they don't inhere in God at all. They just are out there. That's a simpler theory. You're like, moral facts are weird. Moral facts plus God is even weirder. So you don't answer one weirdness in philosophy by positing something even stranger to explain it. So I mean, if I were I'm sure like I'm going to get angry emails from like people who do divine command theory telling me I'm not being fair to them. But in my experience, when they say that, they then give me an article that's even more mysterious than what I just argued against. And I'm like, okay, like the thing I argued against you think is wrong, but the thing you gave me as a better response is even weirder. So again, I'm not saying that you shouldn't believe in God. I'm not saying you should be an atheist. I'm not making any claims about that, but I'm just saying that like, actually, here's a good way of putting it. One of my mentors, Mark Timmons, has this really good ethics textbook. And the funny thing he does is he has divine command theory cultural relativism and ethical subjectivism all in the same chapter. He says these chapters they're actually all rejections of moral objectivism. That's what they are. All of them agree. Subjectivism says the content of morality is determined by me. I get to just decide what right and wrong is. Cultural relativism says the content of morality is arbitrary. It's decided by the French. And divine command theory says the content of morality is arbitrary. It's decided by God. They're all ethics by authority, where you pick a person and say morality is what they say it is because they say it. And he's like, none of these are objectivist views. Objective morality views have to say that like this would be right and wrong even if God didn't say so. Even if God didn't exist, it'd still be right and wrong. So I think Prager, one reason I like Prager is because he's some sort of relativist, and I think relativism is wrong. I think the only reasonable positions are nihilism, there's no morality at all, or objectivism. But subjectivism, including divine command theory, yeah.
So let's say I replace Don Lemon with you, and you are going to host the presidential debate between Trump and Biden. What are some questions you would want to ask those candidates, assuming 100 million people are watching?
I'd say, hey, there's a consensus among economists left and right. Let me hand you a stack of paper showing this, that open borders would double world product. Why aren't any of you guys talking? Why are you guys both defending economic restrictions on the free mobility of labor? Something like that. I put it in a more forceful way to make them feel worse, but something like that. I'd probably also say something like, hasn't your track record shown that both of you are incompetent to lead, and don't you owe it to the American people to do something different? Like you're both terrible at this, so why are you volunteering? Like, shouldn't you take it upon yourselves not to run for president? And then they'd probably kick me out dragging. I probably would just like ask them really hard questions about their personal life, about like, the various people they sexually assaulted and so on. I bring up all the bad things that like Biden did in his past and voted for, and what Trump did, and then I'd get kicked out. But I mean, if I had to ask them a policy question, I would just want to know, why is it that the range of debate about, say, immigration and trade is so far away from like the consensus view in economics? And then when Trump starts responding to me, I'd be like, hey, dude, can you just explain to me the theory of comparative advantage? I don't even care if you think it's right. Just explain to me what that is. Because one of the things you find is that it's very rare that you can find there are people, but there's very rare that you can find people who can explain what it is who don't also accept it. It's like, so it's evidence that they don't know what they're talking about.
Sure. Let's say that we're discussing a lot of morality from one person to another living in a society. If you are, you find yourself on an island, you're going to be there forever. Do you still think you would have moral obligations, or morality could still exist if you exist without any other people around you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. There's this question of like, do you have obligations to yourself? That's fundamentally like, do you owe it to yourself to treat yourself in a certain way? Can there be failures of self-respect? I'm not sure. I find certain arguments pretty convincing, but I also find things like kind of convincing. Like, well, I mean, I tend to think that like your personal welfare is partly subjective, and so you can kind of go on your preferences, but I also think that people can make errors in reasoning about their own subjective welfare, and they can do things that hurt themselves. So I think maybe like one of the best people to read on this, if someone's interested on a better answer than what I'll give, is Jean Hampton. She has all these papers about the ethics of self-respect and like why people owe things to themselves. She even makes arguments that like people who are subservient to others are often engaging in a form of self-disrespect, and they're blameworthy for that. So yeah, I tend to think there are obligations of self-respect, that the reasons I have to respect you are reasons I have to respect me. But the complication here is that we can more easily opt out of things. Like I cannot on your behalf decide that you're going to be in a boxing match, but I can on my behalf. On the other hand, if I just decide like, if I don't take seriously my own welfare, it seems like people are blameworthy for that. Yeah, I mean, actually, that's a pretty good example of a case. So I'm like thinking about this out loud as you bring it up. And I think that's a case where I'd feel comfortable blaming somebody. If I'm alone on a desert island and I could have, with minimal levels of prudence, done things to make my situation pretty good, and I don't do them. If I act like the grasshopper rather than the ant and I starve to death, I think that when I die and get to heaven, that St. Peter can be like, you, or Jesus, whoever it might be, who like meets you at the door, is like, you did not treat yourself properly. You should have made better choices. You are blameworthy for not being prudent. So, okay, I guess I think there are obligations to the self.
And I want to finish with 5 questions, one very similar to the other. What is the most important thing you learned from the works of Michael Huemer?
Oh, God, there's so many things. You know, I'm not answering quickly just because I like Huemer stuff so much that it's hard to pick. I think what I like the most about Huemer, rather than the substantive content, is the methodological style. So Huemer is very much, some philosophers do something like this. First, let me give you a crappy argument for some big theory that you probably won't believe, and then let me just explore the implications of that theory. So an example of that would be John Rawls. John Rawls is a great political philosopher, but fundamentally what he does in the theory of justice is give you an incomplete, somewhat ad hoc, not particularly compelling argument for a couple principles of justice, which happen to correspond with what the average Democrat in 1968 to 1972 would have believed anyways, and then he kind of explores what that theory would mean. Huemer is very much more of he's more like Peter Singer, where he's like, you, the reader, believe this, you believe this, and you believe this. Here are 3 common sense moral views and empirical views which you probably already have. Now I'm going to show you that these lead to some surprising conclusion that you didn't realize, which means that you either have to accept this conclusion or you have to give up one of these things you already believe. Right? And that's, I think, a powerful way to do philosophy. Rather than my crazy theory implies some crazy result, you're like, the thing you, the reader, already think implies something you weren't aware of. So I very much try to emulate Huemer in my work, where I try to rely upon common sense moral ideas, and like I argue for not common sense conclusions, but I try to show that they follow from common sense moral ideas, and the reason that we don't already endorse them is because of our own ethical confusion. And if I have an empirical claims, then I back them up with the evidence to support them.
Yeah, you did a terrific job in Against Democracy with your jury analogy. Can't recommend this book enough. What is the most important thing you learned from Bryan Caplan?
The rational irrationality thesis. That's the most important thing. The rational irrationality thesis is the claim that the reason that people, like, remember rational ignorance from previously in the discussion, people don't know things because the cost of knowing it is higher than the value of knowing it. Rational irrationality is in addition to that. It says processing information in a careful way takes time and effort and is difficult. Indulging bias, indulging false beliefs can sometimes have a positive benefit, and it's fun to do sometimes. So the thesis here is that people will be rational in their in an epistemic sense. They will think scientifically and carefully about an issue if the benefits exceed the costs, and otherwise they won't. And so if you take seriously neoclassical economics and these ideas, it says that the typical voter is going to allow themselves to indulge bias, allow themselves to indulge their worst thought processes, is not going to think carefully about something because their vote doesn't matter very much. The cost to them of being rational exceed the benefits of being rational. So it's instrumentally valuable to be epistemically irrational. So I learned that from him. I read a draft of his 2007 book, Myth of the Rational Voter, before it was published, and he was nice enough to share that with me. And that really, I knew a lot of the facts about like the stuff about ignorance and so on before, but I think I learned from him just how bad it is, and that it's not simply an information problem, but that voters have such a pervasive incentive problem that it explains why they behave badly, like why they reason badly and act like jerks.
What is the most important thing you learned from John Hasness?
I think the most important thing I learned from John Hasness is that most theories of law are garbage. Like, these sort of judicial theories about what law is and also where it comes from, that the majority of the basic law that holds our lives together evolved through sort of Hayekian mechanisms, and that a lot of the structure of law that we think of that's on the books came later. But the law came first through human experience and as in the form of custom and other things, and then it was later codified by lawmakers and usually messed up when they did it. And also, like, when you think about what the law is, without getting into what they are, there are these like theories of jurisprudence in the philosophy of law, like natural law theory and so on. And I think he convinced me to just be a realist. Like, what is the law? Well, fundamentally, the law is going to be whatever the thing is that the judges enforce. The laws are the rules that get enforced, and everything else is something else.
What's the most important thing you learned from John Tomasi?
I think John Tomasi really reinforced for me the idea that there's this kind of narrative among libertarians, which doesn't make sense, but you can see why they did it. It was like back in the 50s, the socialists are like, we care about positive rights and welfare. So therefore, then libertarians respond by being like, oh, well, we just care about negative rights. And that it's like, but their thing doesn't actually deliver the welfare and your thing does. Like capitalism actually delivers the goods and socialism doesn't. Right? Demonstrably, it doesn't. But you have this weird thing where like socialists advocate a system which undermines human prosperity and welfare, and they do it in the name of human prosperity and welfare. And then like classical liberals and libertarians started advocating a system which in fact promotes human welfare and in fact promotes equality, in fact promotes the things that socialists say they care about, but they were doing it in the name of negative rights and like with saying like we don't have to care about social justice. So I think what John Tomasi taught me was to like realize that if you look at the main line of classical liberal thought from like Adam Smith onward, it has always been welfarist and humanitarian, and that we should endorse that. And we get to use the word social justice. If we think about what that word really means, we use it properly, it refers to the thing that we're defending, and that it's okay to say that. You can take that word back from the left. In fact, most people on the left don't even really deserve it.
And finally, what is the most important thing you learned from the works of David Schmitz?
From the works of David Schmitz, Dave, I feel like it's almost not fair to Dave to talk about what I learned from his writing, because it pales in comparison to what I learned, and I learned a lot from him, but it pales in comparison to what I learned from him as a person. Dave was a tremendous mentor to me. He was a tremendous personal example. He's a guy who lives his life with continual ongoing integrity. He's had, I can't even disclose some of the situations, but he's had Ayn Rand type situations where people are trying to buy his soul and he refuses. All right? He's like that. He's just a person of like immense integrity and a strong and continual work ethic. He's a wise person. So philosophers are often very smart, but they're rarely wise. But Dave is a person who's wise, and one thing I like about him is that he expects this of others. He has, without being heavy-handed, without being a person who constantly points fingers, because oftentimes that sort of behavior is just self-aggrandizing. Even when I call Michael Sandel evil, I'm just like having fun with it to be self-aggrandizing on the show. But I don't, Dave is not like that. Dave is a person who he has expectations of others because he has enough respect for them to think that he can hold them to that. So I think what I learned from Dave is, this is sort of a model of like what a good mentor should be and how to be a good person as a philosopher. And I'm known as being combative and hot-headed and so on. And so I'm not necessarily living up to all of that stuff. Like he and I have different personalities on that particular thing, but he taught me work ethic. He at least reinforced work ethic, being conscientious, thinking ahead, having a plan, knowing how to like structure your life in a way where you can like get the career that you want and at the same time have the life that you want, and showing that it can be done too. Yeah. So Dave, I mean, lots of good philosophy stuff. You can see his stuff all throughout my work, but that's more important.
Awesome. Professor Brennan, thanks so much for taking the time. It's nice when a college dropout like me gets the chance to talk to a professor like you. Again, the 3 books today: Political Philosophy and Introduction, When All Else Fails, and Against Democracy. Appreciate your time, sir.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate you having me.